Kamala Harris as my vice president. Now that she will be our party's nominee, I couldn't be prouder. Let's win this. All right, this week we witnessed the result of the years of Biden-Harris diplomacy in action. Late last night, President Biden and Vice President Harris welcomed the freed Americans Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, and Alsu Karmasheva home after they arrived on U.S. soil late last night, just hours after the administration secured the largest and most complex prisoner exchange since the Cold War. President Biden and Vice President Harris spoke to reporters about the multi-country negotiations.
The toughest call on this one for other countries is I asked them to do some things that were against their immediate self-interest, and really very difficult for them to do, particularly Germany and Slovenia. Slovenia came in at the last minute, and I tell you what, the chancellor was incredible.
This is just an extraordinary testament to the importance of having a president who understands the power of diplomacy and understands the strength that rests in understanding the significance of diplomacy and strengthening alliances.
Just hours later, the Harris campaign announced this morning it had raised $310 million in July. That's more than double what Trump raised last month. The New York Times reports, quote, the surge in fundraising has allowed Democrats for the first time in months to have a cash-on-hand advantage over Republicans. The Harris campaign said it now has $377 million in its war chest, in contrast to the $327 million the Trump campaign says it has. The biggest development for candidate Trump today is about one of the prosecutions against him. Donald Trump's January 6th federal election subversion case is officially back in the hands of Judge Tanya Chutkan. Barbara McQuaid, who will join us shortly, told the Washington Post, quote, there is some urgency to the case because the public has a right to a speedy trial, just as the defense does. And if Donald Trump is not elected president, this case will go to trial eventually. So the prosecution and the judge have a duty to protect that right by acting with urgency. Now, as for the Trump campaign, the fallout continues from Donald Trump's disastrous racist interview with the National Association of Black Journalists. Axios reports today that while Donald Trump blamed his late start on an audio issue, quote, the bigger problem was his threat not to take the stage when he had agreed to go on. He did not want to be fact-checked, but we could not let him on the stage without fact-checking. That's according to the NABJ president, Ken Lemon. While Donald Trump avoided more attacks today on Vice President Harris's racial identity, he had this to say about a possible debate with her.
Are you going to debate her?
Well, I want to. We're leading in the polls, it seems, by quite a bit still. She's better than he is, but I think ultimately she'll be worse than him.
Joining us now is the Democratic Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland of Washington State. Congresswoman, thank you for being with us. You know, on one hand, we don't want to debate for too long Donald Trump's nonsensical statements at NABJ, but there's some fundamental misunderstanding that either he has or he's deliberately trying to sow about the tens of millions of people in this country who have multiple ethnic or racial identities.
He definitely has. And he talked about Kamala Harris, the vice president, in terms of, is she really black? And as long as I have known of Vice President Harris, even during her time as district attorney, as a senator, as vice president, obviously, she has always proudly talked about being Indian American and African American. So his attempt to try and divide the Democratic Party was not successful, and it looks like it's backfiring on him. On top of that...
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, I'm not sure it's going to land with anyone, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say, you know, it's interesting because when he agreed to take the stage at the National Association of Black Journalists, he was not there to try and convince the African-American community or African-American journalists to support him or why they should vote for him. He was there as a con man, as a performer to sow chaos. He was talking over them. He wouldn't answer questions, and he was just trying to divide because Kamala Harris is the most qualified person to be President Biden's successor because of her record, because of her serving with him for 3.5 years during tumultuous times, both here at home and abroad. So he has nothing. So he's now just trying to drag up anything to see if it sticks. and it's not sticking.
I want to read something that you wrote in an op-ed called The Black and Asian Experience. You wrote this for the Northwest Asian Weekly after these comments. You write, mixed race leaders can bring coalitions together, often among disparate groups. It's how we've had to navigate the world our entire lives. People ask me if I consider myself more black or Korean. Why must I choose? I benefit from the best of both worlds, what we've overcome and what we've contributed to this nation. I come from enslaved people who built this country, fought for it, and were denied basic rights. I come from people who came to America not knowing the language or customs and were treated like outsiders who don't belong here. You clearly painted this as a strength, an advantage, which I think that's how most Americans see this. Tell me a little bit more about this, because even Republicans are outraged at what happened the other day.
So remember, when Vice President Harris was announced as the person that President Biden supports, the attack started immediately. First, they tried to say she was a failed border czar, when in fact, people coming over the southern border has decreased by 50% through President Biden's executive order. And there is a bill sitting in the Senate, a bipartisan bill to address the border that Donald Trump demanded not come to the floor. So if anyone's going to have responsibility, it lands solely with Donald Trump. When I think about the statement that I wrote, though, I think about the fact that for us in the Democratic Party, we view our identity as an asset. And think about the enthusiasm, the volunteers signing up, the first-time donor to this campaign. People are energized and excited and ready to get to work for Vice President Harris. And that means that things aren't looking so good for Mr. Trump. So instead of trying to come up with something policy-related, because he has nothing, he's trying to attack her identity. So to his base, her identity is something that is a liability. To us, it is an asset. And it's obvious that the Black community is energized, the Asian American community is energized, and a lot of people who are kind of just sleepwalking through the election are now ready to get to work to make her the next president of the United States.
Let's talk about doing that instead of talking about policy. At least you'd think in the House maybe there's some policy, but there's just been a tweet from CBS News congressional reporter Scott MacFarlane about some upcoming bills on the Republican side of the House, all having to do with Trump. Let me just list some of these to you. Ordering the U.S. Mint to print $500 bills with Donald Trump's portrait on them, renaming Dulles Airport for Donald Trump, renaming U.S. coastal waters for Donald Trump, expunging his impeachments, formally declaring he didn't engage in insurrection, and declaring Donald Trump was politically persecuted. I don't know if that doubles for policy in your world, but doesn't in mine.
No, it doesn't. So instead of coming up with these ridiculous ways to honor Donald Trump, what they need to do is focus on getting a farm bill passed. Yep. What we need to do is focus on these appropriations bills. What we need to do is work on avoiding a government shutdown in September. What they need to do is come up with a suggestion of how we're going to try and reduce costs for families. They have nothing at all to run on. And this is why they're engaging in these games and this ridiculous behavior, because Democrats are there to govern and to do the people's work. They are doing the opposite. And this is really in line with Trump's Project 2025, right? Mm-hmm. It's an attempt to dismantle government, to have loyalty to Trump, and to give this man far too much power. And this is why we have to win in November.
It's actually a central tenet of Project 2025, the idea of getting experts out of government and bringing loyalists in. This very much seems like sort of countries you read about, you know, where there's an overthrow and then the streets are renamed and the schools are renamed. And this is not, right. This is exactly what Project 2025 has in mind.
Exactly. So this is just, you know, for all of Trump's denial about Project 2025, yeah, or for extreme elements of the GOP saying that's not us, we have nothing to do with it, they are using the playbook to the T. And so this demonstrates what can happen if Trump is elected. Again, we have momentum, but as Democrats, we can never take anything for granted. This is going to be a tough race, and this is why we have to show up. 80 million people did not vote in the 2020 election. So we need to show up.
An important point. About as many people as voted for Joe Biden who could have voted didn't vote. That's where the opportunity lies, and that's where our responsibility as American citizens lie, to try and make sure those people come out and vote. Congresswoman, thank you for being with us tonight. Democratic Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland. All right, joining us now is Barbara McQuaid, former United States attorney, law professor at the University of Michigan Law School, and the co-host of the podcast Sisters in Law. She's also an MSNBC legal analyst. Barbara, great to see you. Thank you for being with us. And this is one of those nights when it just needs your help understanding Donald Trump, the case is now back with Tanya Chutkan, and she's got a lot of decisions to make and things to do without very specific guidance from the Supreme Court about what to do about the existing case against Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's right. You know, what she knows is that there is this edict from the Supreme Court that certain conduct by a former president is immune from prosecution. Unofficial acts are not. And it's her job now to decide which of the allegations in the indictment fall within which bucket. I imagine if I were in Tanya Chutkan's shoes, what I would do is arrange for a status conference to bring the parties in and talk through how to proceed. But I also think that in fairly short order, we're going to have a hearing here in one way or another for her to decide which of those acts alleged in the indictment are immune and which are not, so that the case can proceed to trial.
Help me with this, because as a prosecutor, your job would be to help the judge come to a conclusion based on the law. There are lots of people in this country who think what the Supreme did was perverse, that it's not actually in keeping with the law or the Constitution. So how does Tanya Chutkan walk that line when she probably doesn't believe some of what the Supreme Court said to be true, but she's got to stick to those rules? She's got to stick within those lines.
Oh, absolutely. You know, there are many times when judges have to follow the law that they don't like. I know I've spoken to many judges, for example, who are opposed to mandatory minimum sentences and yet find themselves required to impose them. So I think she will do her best to follow the ruling. It may even be that Jack Smith decides to pare down the indictment from some of the allegations that are clearly in the protected category that the Supreme Court has announced. For example, the allegations relating to Donald Trump's demand to the Justice Department to falsely claim that they had found fraud in the election. Those are going to be, I think, quite clearly protected by the immunity. But there are some other areas that are a little bit grayer. The areas where Donald Trump is talking to Mike Pence in his capacity as president of the Senate and urging him not to certify the outcome of the election. I think that's a little bit of a gray area. And then there are other areas that I think are very likely not protected and will be considered private conduct, arranging false slates of electors and pressuring state officials to put together alternate slates of electors. I think those are all going to be fair game. But the other really tricky part about the court's decision, Allie, is the part that even Amy Coney Barrett really backed away from. And that was the part where the court said you can't even use as evidence official acts to prove crimes committed in unofficial acts. And so that's where that conversation with Mike Pence becomes such a gray area. But that's what the court's going to have to work through. Judge Chutkan will either hear testimony from these witnesses or will rely on the parties to produce what's called a written proffer to say, here's the allegation, we think it's not protected, and here's how we're going to prove it through the following evidence, which we also think is not protected and should proceed. She'll make a decision, and no doubt we will see some party appeal her decision. Sure. And so I don't think this case will be coming to trial anytime soon.
But your valid point is it needs to not stop. It needs to carry on, because that's how the justice system has to work. Barbara, great to see you. Thank you for your very, very clear explanations. Barbara McQuade. All right, coming up, the Democratic plan to push back on the Supreme Court's extremism. That's next.
Democracy is egalitarian, which means it's for everyone. But it also, I think, is a divinely inspired gift of our forefathers to show us that we can lead ourselves.
One of the things I like about what I get to do is that each day is pretty unique. I might wake up and find out there's a brand new poll out, and I want to dive into it and get something on air about that poll. Or I might find out that there's not a lot of new numbers in the world today, and so today's going to be a day I'm going to spend researching, learning about a state, about the different counties, about the voter history, about the demographic trends, and just committing that all to memory. The only way to really be prepared is to get it all in my brain ahead of time.
Donald Trump, a convicted felon who has not yet paid for his crimes, is eligible to run for president, but a person who served their sentence is not eligible to vote. That's the current situation in Mississippi. Last month, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, one of the most conservative courts in the nation, restored the lifetime felony disenfranchisement provision of Mississippi's state constitution. That provision has kept an estimated 50,000 people from exercising their right to vote. In his dissent, senior judge James Dennis wrote, "Voting is the lifeblood of our democracy, and the deprivation of the right to vote saps citizens of the ability to have a say in how and by whom they are governed. Permanent denial of the franchise, then, is an exceptionally severe penalty, constituting nothing short of the denial of the democratic core of American citizenship," end quote. The challengers of Mississippi's felony disenfranchisement law must now decide whether to appeal to the Supreme Court, a Supreme Court that has a terrible record on civil rights. President Biden made the case this week, commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act.
In recent years, extreme opinions that the Supreme Court has handed down have undermined long-established civil rights principles and protections. In 2013, the Supreme Court in Shelby County case gutted the Voting Rights Act, opening the floodgates to a wave of restrictive voting laws that have seen states across the country pass. In 2022, the court overruled Roe v. Wade and the right to choose that had been the law of the land for 50 years. 50 years. The following year, the same court eviscerated affirmative action, which had been upheld and reaffirmed for nearly 50 years as well.
The president has called for term limits for Supreme Court justices and an ethics code enforcement, as well as a constitutional amendment to overturn the court's ruling on presidential immunity.
This month, the Supreme Court basically just told the former president, who has been convicted of fraud, that going forward, he will be immune for activity we know he is prepared to engage in if he gets back into the White House. Recall, Donald Trump has openly vowed, if reelected, to be a dictator on day one, that he will weaponize the Department of Justice against his political enemies, that he will round up peaceful protesters and throw them out of our country, and even, quote, terminate the United States Constitution.
Joining us now is Melissa Murray, professor of law at NYU and an MSNBC legal analyst. She's co-author of the book, The Trump Indictments. Melissa, so much to talk to you about, but I'm really trying to talk to a lot of people like you who really follow the court this week to understand what is good about what President Biden has suggested in terms of court reform and what is doable. And a lot of people have told me that the constitutional amendment is probably the heaviest lift and the hardest part, but worth pursuing because we don't have a lot of options.
So, Ali, I will just first say that there's probably not a lot of traction that this is going to get in real time as we speed toward an election. But I think it is incredibly huge and significant that Joe Biden, someone who has been known as a moderate, as an institutionalist, has been so disappointed in this court and what it's done that it's even transformed him into someone who is now seeking court reform in a more contained or a more clear way. I mean, so that by itself, I think, is part of the story here. This court is so far off the rails that even Joe Biden, who is a stalwart institutionalist, has said that it's time for something to be done. These reforms are relatively modest. Most people in this country support term limits for justices. And in fact, in most constitutional courts around the world, term limits are the norm. We are the outlier on that front. You're right that the really, I think, important and consequential reform is the call for a constitutional amendment. And of course, that will be the heaviest lift. under our constitutional system, in order to get a constitutional amendment, you have to either go through Congress and get a supermajority in both houses of Congress, and then go to the state legislatures and get supermajorities in 3/4 of the states there. That's going to be a really hard lift. The other alternative is to start with the state legislatures. But either way, given our polarized political environment, it's going to be very difficult to get a constitutional amendment passed. But the fact that we're talking about this at all means the Democrats are ready to make the court part of their electoral discourse. And I think it's high time that that happened.
Melissa, let's talk about Senator Chuck Schumer is introducing a bill called the No Kings Act, which would do a couple of things. One, it would reaffirm that presidents and vice presidents do not have immunity for actions that violate U.S. criminal law, eliminating the distinction between official acts and non-official acts. Number two, it would remove the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction for all actions challenging the constitutionality of this legislation. And number three, it would establish additional jurisdictional and procedural guardrails. More likely that this bill can get passed at some point than a constitutional amendment. Does this go some distance in securing what the Supreme Court, in offsetting what the Supreme Court has done?
Certainly, this is a statutory fix. So as you say, it's going to be a little bit easier than getting a constitutional amendment passed. I think it can have some really important fixes here and can do a lot in the short term. But remember, this can also be challenged, as much legislation is challenged, and eventually it may make its way up to the Supreme Court. And we've already seen what the Supreme Court can do. And it's very clear, I think, what it might do with a law that seeks to restrain it in this way. So, I mean, I think it's very unlikely that the court that gave Donald Trump this sweeping grant of presidential immunity would see fit to affirm a law that reined that in. So I think that's one of the reasons why a constitutional amendment is more desirable, even if it is more elusive. But again, the Democrats are making this a focus, and I think that's really the story here. I think Chuck Schumer knows what the stakes are, but the bigger question is to make this case to the American people.
One of the other things that President Biden has suggested is an enforceable code of ethics for the Supreme Court, and something that both Lawrence Tribe and Judge Ludig have told me this week is that there's no reason why the Supreme Court wouldn't be subject to the ethics codes that all federal judges are. They've just kind of decided that they're not.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, in some ways, this is really, really low-hanging fruit to insist that justices of the highest court of the land adhere to some modest ethics rules, of the same very modest ethics rules that lower court judges have to adhere to. The fact that we're having this conversation at all, I think, really points to the fact that we've had an entire year of just being assailed with reports of some of these justices having emotional support billionaires, and having those emotional support billionaires have ties to the work that the court does. It's not great for the court's optics. It's not great for the court's legitimacy, and it really should stop. And I think, again, this is a very modest fix, and one that is eminently doable if the court would agree.
Melissa, as bad as this court is, I think this goes back to your point about making this an issue in the election. It can get worse.
Oh, 100%. There are two justices on this court, Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. Those are the ones we've had the most reports about having emotional support billionaires. They're septuagenarians. It's very likely that they want to retire at some point. Obviously, they would prefer to retire under a Trump presidency. And if they do retire under a Trump presidency, they will be replaced by younger movement conservatives. And this conservative 6-3 supermajority that we've been dealing with will last for another generation and a half. And there's no telling what kind of work they could do under those conditions. So the court is on the ballot in this election cycle, even if it means that we aren't necessarily talking about reform, but just simply staying the course right now and keeping this from getting worse.
Melissa, it's great to talk to you as always. Thank you for being with us. Melissa Murray is an NYU professor of law and an MSNBC legal analyst. Coming up, Donald Trump will do anything to get people to stop talking about Project 2025. He's now peddling tax cut policy in all caps with zero specifics. And there's definitely something weird about the waitress story that he's been telling. We'll do that fact check next.
MSNBC Live Democracy 2024, Saturday, September 7th in Brooklyn, New York. Join your favorite MSNBC hosts at our premier live audience event to break down all that's at stake in this historic election. Visit msnbc.com/democracy 2024 to buy your tickets today.
All right, you're going to want to watch and save this segment. It's a fact check on Trump's scam tax policies. This is maybe not for your crazy conspiracy-touting uncle. He's a lost cause. But perhaps for the person in your life who doesn't like Trump but is intrigued by this new promise he's just made to give money to grandmas and waitresses via no tax on Social Security for seniors, no tax on tips. Ah, yes, the all-caps, no specifics policy. It seems legit. I'm sure Trump thinks it's a lot better than having the media focus on the very specific and detailed Project 2025. Well, here's the actual deal with what Trump is apparently suggesting. It should come as no surprise that the all-caps tax relief that Donald Trump is promising are actually backdoor ways to give rich people big tax breaks. Here's how Donald Trump claims he came up with the idea for no tax on tips at a restaurant in Las Vegas.
The waitress comes over. How's everything going? A really nice person. How's everything? Oh, sir, it's so tough. The government's after me all the time on tips, tips, tips. I said, well, they give you cash. Would they be able to find him? She said, actually, and I didn't know this. She said, very little cash is given. It's all put right on the check. And they come in and they take so much of our money. It's just ridiculous. I said to her, let me just ask you a question. Would you be happy if you had no tax on tips? She said, what a great idea. I got my information from a very smart waitress.
That the supposed waitress addressed him as sir is the first tell that the story might not be on the level. But here's the thing. Trump's proposal isn't actually about a few bucks on a diner meal. An analysis from the Center on American Progress finds, quote, the tax cuts it would provide low and moderate wage tipped workers would be small or non-existent, and it contains few, if any, guardrails to prevent high-income professionals, such as hedge fund managers, from shifting their compensation to a tax-free tipping model, end quote. No tax on tips for hedge fund managers. Sir, that is not a great idea. And how about this? Seniors should not pay tax on Social Security. Again, sounds nice in theory, but in reality, the plan would provide little to no relief for lower and moderate income seniors who don't receive enough income to generate tax, while giving a boon to rich Americans who all receive Social Security but earn enough for that small amount of income to be taxed. The reduction of income to the government from the tax breaks to them, to the wealthy, would in fact contribute to draining the Social Security Trust Fund, which you know would be a problem for grandma who relies on those benefits to survive. Not so much of a problem for 92-year-old billionaire Warren Buffett, who, like every American who is paid into Social Security, has earned that benefit. Even Fox Business host Maria Bartiromo got that it won't work, and Trump didn't have an answer.
The Committee for a Responsible Budget says that that will mean increasing deficits by $1.6 to $1.8 trillion.
Because we can cut other costs. There's so much waste in our government. The other
so that's what I want to ask. Where do you get the revenue to offset that? Because it's also apparently going to advance the insolvency date of Social Security's retirement trust fund by over a year.
Well, you know, one of the things good about that is that's when people will make a deal. You know that. But we're going to take care of Social Security. We're not going to do anything to hurt our seniors. There is so much cutting. There is so much waste in this government. There's so much fat in this government. I also have no tax on tips. That's a big deal.
It's not actually that big a deal. Joining us now is Brendan Duke, Senior Director of Economic Policy at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. He was an advisor to the Biden-Harris National Economic Council. Brendan, there's so much to explore here, but let's just start with the tips, all right? It'll have virtually no income effect on anybody making less than $28,000 a year. That's about $14 an hour if you're talking about an hourly wage, which is what a lot of people who are in the service industry earn. This is not what Donald Trump is suggesting that it is.
No. It is the Trump University of tax plans. That's the best way to put it. Trump wine, Trump steaks, take your pick, right? So Ted Cruz took Donald Trump's idea, ran with it, turned it into legislation. And when you look at it, it just doesn't make any sense. So as you said, the problem is tipped workers just don't make much money. So they don't pay that much in income taxes. So over a third of tipped workers don't pay $1 in income taxes, so don't get $1 of tax cut. Some of them would get their child tax credit cut. So as you were saying, let's take a married couple, makes $28,000, one's a waiter, one's a student, $0 of tax cut from this because they just don't make enough money to get a tax cut. Vice President Harris, on the other hand, does have a plan to cut their taxes. She would cut their taxes by $600 by increasing the earned income tax credit. I think Donald Trump was already president. We know what his tax policy is. It's tax cuts for the wealthy, pennies for the low and middle income families.
But let's also be clear, the tax cuts for the wealthy did not have the trickle-down effect, right? Nothing has the trickle-down effect anymore. It's just not true. So it just ended up, Maria Bartiromo had it right. It ends up just increasing the deficit, which then is an excuse to cut more benefits to people who need them.
Yeah, absolutely. Or I think what's actually crazy and hasn't gotten enough attention is Donald Trump's talking about extending his tax cuts for the wealthy, but this time he's going to pay for it with a 10% tax on every imported good coming into the country. Groceries, clothing, basically everything you buy at Walmart and Amazon costs a typical family $2,600, wipes up every tax cut that they get that he's promising. It's just a scam. It's Trump University all over again.
Interesting when Bartiromo asked him about the effect on Social Security, the Social Security Trust Fund, the idea that it'll extend or it'll shorten by a period the time in which that could run out of money. He said, we'll take care of it. We'll fix it. That was an opportunity for him to say how he would fix it and not actually harm it. And this is the answer. This is the policy answer. We'll fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, he's kind of a con artist. We're just seeing it all over again. This is a $1.5 trillion cut to Social Security and Medicare. Medicare also gets the revenue, so it also means cuts to Medicare benefits. It pushes forward the date that these automatic cuts happen and increases the severity of the projected cuts to Social Security and Medicare. This is not a tax cut. This is a cut to Social Security and Medicare benefits.
What is this thing about the fact that people can recharacterize how they earn money and very wealthy people might be able to take advantage of this as opposed to servers at restaurants?
Yeah, sure. So the Cruz's bill is not very well written. And so basically, there's not really much of a guardrail to prevent someone from turning wage income into tips. So you can imagine a hedge fund manager, they talk with their client and say, look, you know, it'll save me some money if, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, why don't you tip me instead of just paying my normal fee? And all of a sudden, it's tax-free for them. It would be the biggest loophole in the income tax code, this idea. So let's take a hedge fund manager making $1 million. If they convert half of that $1 million into tips instead of salary, that's a $180,000 tax cut each year just with the wave of the hand. It makes carried interest look like chump change.
It's just amazing to have this discussion to realize how one single two-sentence, all-caps social media post can be as misleading as it is. This went from, hey, he's going to do great things for Social Security and people getting tips. It's entirely something else. Brendan, thanks very much for your work on this. We appreciate it. Brendan Duke is the Senior Director of Economic Policy at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. All right, coming up, in the few weeks since she's been the top of the Democratic presidential ticket, Vice President Kamala Harris has locked up critically important endorsements from unions across the country. Up next, we'll be joined by the president of the very first union to endorse her, the American Federation of Teachers.
This isn't Charmin. No wonder I don't feel as clean.
Hurry up, Dad. You've been in there forever.
I'm trying. This cheap stuff is too thin.
I told you not to get the other toilet paper. Here's Charmin Ultra Strong.
Ah, my bottom's been saved.
With its diamond weave texture, Charmin Ultra Strong cleans better with fewer sheets and less effort.
What's everybody waiting for? This?
Okay, hon. We know you're clean. We all go. Why not enjoy the go with Charmin?
MSNBC Live Democracy 2024, Saturday, September 7th in Brooklyn, New York. Join your favorite MSNBC hosts at our premier live audience event. Visit msnbc.com/democracy2024 to buy your tickets today.
As you may know, I am a proud product of public education. Many of you know that my first grade teacher, Mrs. Frances Wilson, God rest her soul, taught me and educated me and encouraged me and inspired me. And years later, when I walked across the stage to receive my law school diploma, Mrs. Frances Wilson was in the audience. Yeah. And that's who you are. I know who you are. I know who you are. This work is personal, and it is professional, and it is so critically important.
Vice President Kamala Harris got personal while speaking to the 88th annual convention of the American Federation of Teachers last week. Getting the backing from these kinds of unions is critical to a successful White House run. And the vice president made sure that the American Federation of Teachers knew how thankful she was for their support after President Biden stepped aside and endorsed her.
It is you who have taken on the most noble of work, which is to concern yourself with the well-being of the children of America. And I thank you for that. I thank you for that. And I thank you also for your support over the years and for being the first union to endorse me this week.
Joining us now is Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers. Randy, great to see you. Thank you for being with us. The stakes for educators are substantially higher than they were 4 years ago, 8 years ago. It's only actually become harder, not just from a wage and earning perspective, but just the way you all do your jobs and the battlefront that you're all on now.
Well, first off, Ali, thank you for having me on. And, you know, I think what's happened is that the GOP, for reasons that I don't understand, because lots of Republicans have kids in school and love their local schools, but they have decided to make target practice with public education and with teachers and their unions. And they've done it for a long time. But the difference between then and now is that the culture wars have just made it much, much harder to teach at the very same time as our kids need the kind of well-being, much more of the well-being that we would provide in addition to the academics. You know, between social media, between the effects of COVID, we have a huge job to do. We should get paid more, but we're used to not getting paid enough, or, you know, but the issue of banning books, not letting people teach honest history, making these laws so vague that the vagueness is the purpose. All of this has made things much, much, much harder. And I think what the vice president did there in that short moment that you replayed is that she got to the heart of teachers.
Yep.
Teachers teach because they want to make a difference in kids' lives. And then she also lifted up, because we're the second largest nurse union and a large professional public employee union, she lifted up all the work that we do to make people's lives better.
Let's talk about not just the endorsements now, but we're in a selection process for a vice president. For your particular union, there are two issues in looking for a vice president. Someone who either has a history of or an affinity for labor unions, because there's a real moment right now for labor unions, one that we haven't seen for a long time, and then someone who's got a history of or affinity for good public education policy.
Right.
Where does that put you on what should happen?
So I'm glad you raised both of them, because both, and you listen to the vice president speak, you listen to Kamala speak, but I prefer calling her the vice president because I think we should be respectful of her.
Yep.
You listen to the anchoring that she does about opportunity. What creates opportunity? The labor movement economically, the public education. So those two things are our anchors. They're our foundation stones. So what we're trying to do is just hope that, we've had conversations with the campaign, we've had conversations with her staff, we've talked about the different candidates that, that have been mentioned, and they all have positives. And, and she has embarrassment of riches. So we, hopefully she will pick somebody who is in simpatico with her. And she has said she wants to pick a governing partner. And what you see in the country is that the Democrats have a very deep bench. And so she'll pick a governing partner and somebody she has chemistry with. Last thing I'll say is this. Of all the people, she knows what it means to be a vice president.
Right.
So she's going to pick somebody who she can govern with, just like you see the simpatico between President Biden and her right now.
Let's talk about the process. You were fast out the gate to endorse Kamala Harris, and part of that was you'd already had an endorsement of President Biden. Why have we got some unions where this is still an issue? In fact, the Teamsters, for instance, they've started a voting process, and I fully understand they want input from their members. It's going to take a month. Talk to me about the differences in process here.
Well, look, unions are not monoliths, and all of us have different processes. I think the reason that it was easier for us to move quickly is we were having our big governing convention. And if you don't move quickly during your governing convention, then shame on you. We had the members there. We had delegates from all across the country. And the difference was when we've been obviously talking about this for weeks now, and in the aftermath of the president's debate. Let me just say this. President Biden has been a great president. And what he did by saying he's not going to run again was one of the most patriotic things that anyone could do in terms of saying that we need to save our democracy. And then you have Kamala Harris saying, and we need to create the freedoms that people need, and we need to create opportunity for all. So you have this clear contrast between a Donald Trump who still doesn't abide by the 2020 election and a President Biden who says this is what's best for the country. So each union has a different process. What I think was shocking was how fast we all did it, because we understand there's 99 days or 97 days right now, and we have to get in it to win it. We have to talk to our members. We have to talk to communities. That's how this election is going to be won or lost. We have 450,000 members in the battleground states, and our members are trusted by communities. So we need to be talking to people about hope versus fear and real policy that connects to their lives improving.
Randy, as you know, I'm also a product of public education, and we are always grateful to you and your colleagues who have withstood the withering criticism and attacks that you've had over the last 4 years. But you will prevail, and we'll all prevail together. Thank you, my friend. Randy Weingarten.
From your mouth to God's ears.
We'll do it. Randy Weingarten is the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and we'll be right back.
In here, you can expect to find crystal clear audio, expansive display space, endless entertainment, and more comfort for everyone. But even with all that, we still left room for all the unpredictability, spontaneity, and unexpected things you'll find out here. The new 2024 Grand Cherokee lineup. Jeep, there's only one.
Hi, I'm Sally. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm a flight nurse on a helicopter that specializes in trauma. I've been doing flight nursing for 24 years. I had a fear that I wouldn't be able to keep up. I wanted all the boost I could get. I heard about Prevagen from a friend. I read the clinical study on it, and
maintain than Honda. Get 1.9% APR financing or a $2,500 customer bonus on a new 2024 Tiguan.
After careful review of medical guidance and research on pain relief, my recommendation is simple. Every home should have Salonpas. Powerful, yet non-addictive. Targeted and long-lasting. I recommend Salonpas. It's good medicine.
If you're shopping for a home, Realtor.com only shows you homes for sale sourced directly from professionals, meaning you can trust every home listing is a real listing.
Don't all apps do that?
Not really. Trust the #1 app real estate professionals trust.
For more than a decade, Farxiga has been trusted again and again and again. Ask your doctor about Farxiga.
I tried a bunch of different probiotics before seed.
And they didn't help. It addressed my bloating and my irregularity.
It's really helping my daily bowel movements and keeping me pretty regular. I started feeling better and less bloated, felt flatter, lighter. I just keep going back to seed because it actually works.
Now I walk around and smiling every day because I don't get bloated anymore.
If you know luxury, it's not just award-winning, it's rewarding. Sattva Mattresses supports all types of sleepers with durable steel coils and plush organic cotton. Luxury is handcrafted in American factories and brought directly to you with our free in-home white glove delivery service, which is why over 90% of customers would recommend Sattva to friends and family. Sattva, luxury mattresses made affordable.
More than ever, you need clarity. More than ever, trust is everything. More than ever, democracy needs an ally. Facts must win the day, and questions need to be answered. Because more than ever, the work we do will reverberate for generations.
One programming note before we go. On tomorrow's Velshi Band Book Club, Mohsen Hamid's latest surrealist novel, The Last White Man, is a fresh look at a well-trodden concept. What would happen if every white person woke up with brown skin? The Last White Man is a meditation on the construct of race, the realities of loss and death, and a masterclass in surrealist narrative. And despite the familiar Kafkaesque concept, The Last White Man has caused a firestorm. Don't miss tomorrow's Velshi Band Book Club with award-winning author Mohsen Hamid at 10 a.m. Eastern, right here on MSNBC. And that is tonight's last word. The 11th hour with Stephanie Ruhle starts right now, and I'm joining her.
Kamala Harris's campaign now says that she has just crossed the threshold to win the Democratic nomination.
We are going to win this election. We're about to make history with the first female president.
She is exciting young people. She is exciting all these coalitions.
I'm white, I'm the dude, and I'm for Harris.
We're a big tent, and we're here to let people in and let people out.
She's sort of incompetent. She's not very smart, but she's very radical. Very radical.
If you've got something to say it to my face.
I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black.
And it was the same old show. The divisiveness and the disrespect.
Breaking news, those freed American prisoners are now back safely on U.S. soil.
Nothing beyond our capacity to react together. Nothing. I don't know who the hell we are. We're the United States of America.
Good evening once again. I'm Stephanie Ruhle. It is time for the nightcap, and we are now 95 days away from the election. And Kamala Harris is drawing much bigger crowds than we are used to seeing from Democrats this year. Today, the DNC said she officially has got enough delegate votes